For centuries, communication with the dead was believed to be mere superstition, until one man proved otherwise. He didn't use mediums, he didn't summon spirits in rituals. All he needed was a text, an ancient, forbidden manuscript, buried in the shadows of history. No one knows exactly how he got his hands on this document, only that from that moment on, his life was never the same. The voices began to answer. Voices that didn't belong to any living being. Voices that knew things no ordinary man could ever uncover. Some called him a genius, others a madman. But one thing is certain, he knew too much. What was written in that text was so dangerous that it was banned, burned, and locked away in hidden vaults by both the church and governments. Today, you're going to discover the real story of the man who spoke with the dead through a forbidden text. But I must warn you, this knowledge is not for everyone. If you choose to keep watching, there will be no way to unsee what is about to be revealed. If you've made it this far, it's because you feel there's something beyond what we've been told. Here on the channel, we uncover forgotten files, forbidden stories, and secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. So subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because in the next videos we're going to reveal more hidden texts, vanished rituals, and encoded messages left behind by civilizations that mysteriously disappeared. And if this kind of content gives you chills, in a good way, hit the like button so I know you're ready to go even deeper. He had no name in official records, no certificates, no relatives, no photographs, only scattered accounts from residents of a forgotten village in the Romanian countryside who referred to him as the Hermit of the Mist, living in isolation. In a moss-covered cabin shrouded in constant fog, he was rarely seen outside. When he did appear, he walked slowly with old books tucked under his arm, speaking to himself, as if someone were walking beside him. Some children claimed to see him talking to shadows. Others swore they heard whispers coming from the forest, always after his nightly walks. But no one, absolutely no one, knew his real name, until the day a mysterious fire consumed his cabin. Among the ashes, only a charred body was found, and a diary completely untouched. Inside were disturbing notes, meticulous records of conversations with entities that claimed to have died centuries ago. And at the end of the diary, a cryptic signature, "I am merely the voice between worlds." That was the beginning of the greatest mystery involving communication with the dead ever documented, and the start of a story that should never have been told. The charred diary mentioned a forgotten name, Codex Sanguinis. Translated from Latin, it means the Book of Blood. For centuries, this name appeared only in scattered notes, scrawled in the margins of grimoires, cited in letters exchanged between terrified monks and mentioned by inquisitors before mysteriously disappearing. But until then, no one had proven its existence. In the hermit's diary, not only did he confirm that the codex existed, but he also described in detail the content of its first pages, texts in a language that didn't belong to any known alphabet, diagrams of symbols that repeated in tombs, forgotten cathedrals, and sealed crypts. The most disturbing part, however, was the origin he attributed to the book. According to him, the Codex Sanguinis was written by a group of renegade monks in the 13th century who claimed not only to communicate with the dead, but to learn from them. It was said that these monks received direct instructions from the spirit realm to record forbidden secrets, formulas to halt the passage of the soul, seals to imprison entities in physical objects, and invocations capable of opening portals between dimensions. When the Vatican discovered the Codex's existence, they launched a hunt. Books were burned, monks were executed, But one copy survived, hidden in a frozen forest in Transylvania, and it was this copy that the man found. Or perhaps it found him. The story of how he found the Codex Sanguinis begins in an old antique market in Bucharest, where objects of immeasurable value are often exchanged for pennies. The hermit, already old and with few resources, began frequenting the market in search of forgotten relics. But on that day, he found something different, a dark wooden box, unmarked, covered by a thick layer of dust. Inside it, what seemed to be just an ordinary book. But upon touching it, a strange sensation overtook him. The air grew dense, and the sounds around him seemed to fade away. The seller, a man with distant eyes and trembling hands, spoke in a low voice. "This is a book that chooses who possesses it." Curious, and at the same time unsettled, the hermit bought the book and took it back to his secluded cabin. When he opened it for the first time, the words seemed to dance on the pages as if they were alive. A text in a language that didn't belong to the human world. He didn't know it then, but that moment would change his life forever. The first night was peaceful, or at least it seemed to be. But at dawn, something strange happened. When the hermit looked back at the pages, they were different. The text, which had been completely indecipherable before, now seemed clearer. And even more disturbing, the writing began to move, changing, as if something were responding to his questions. "Who is writing this?" he asked aloud. The answer appeared instantly, in a more elegant handwriting, almost as if the ink had been written by invisible hands. "We." And that's how the hermit made contact with something beyond human understanding. From that moment on, he knew he was not alone. And whatever was on the other side, it didn't want to be ignored. That night, the hermit felt something he could never have imagined. When he opened the book, a strange sensation of vertigo took over him. The walls of the cabin began to distort, and a cold wind coming from nowhere wrapped around his skin. He tried to resist, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then he heard it, not with his ears, but with his mind. "Are you ready to listen?" The words were not written in the book. They came from within his own head. Distorted voices, intertwined with a sigh that seemed to come from far away. Shaking, he looked around, but everything was silent. Only the sound of his own breath and the rustling of the wind filled the air. When he looked back at the book, the first page was empty. But when he turned to the second page, he found something he would never forget. A message written in blood. "You are not alone. I am one of the departed, and I am here with you." The hermit froze. The ink seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. But the most terrifying part wasn't the message. It was the name that appeared right beneath it. Valentin Ionescu, a name he had never heard before. But when he searched his memory, a shock hit him. Valentin Ionescu was the name of a childhood friend who had died more than 30 years ago. How is this possible? The book had done more than invoke the memory of a dead person. It had brought his presence back. And for the first time, the hermit realized that the book didn't just tell stories. It brought the dead back to life, even if only for a brief moment. But what he still didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Because as the words continued to appear on the pages, he began to realize that the Codex Sanguinis wasn't limited to summoning souls that had already departed. It was starting to open portals to something much more dangerous. In the days that followed, the hermit could no longer ignore the reality of his situation. Every time he opened the Codex, more words appeared on the pages, not just from Valentin Ionescu, but from other figures he had never known. "I shouldn't be here. What have they done to me? My soul is still trapped in a place you cannot understand. The messages began to grow more unsettling. They were responses to questions he had never asked. Voices of the dead revealing buried secrets, stories that should never have been told. But the most disturbing part of it all was the feeling that the dead weren't just answering. They were asking for something. He received accounts of unsolved murders, crimes that took place in distant villages, as if the dead wanted to be heard, as if something inside them needed to tell their stories no matter the cost. With every page he turned, the hermit began to realize that these souls were not at peace. On the contrary, they were desperate, seeking something he didn't understand, something hidden between the lines of the Codex Sanguinis. One day, after writing a few words on a piece of paper, a response appeared on the next page. But unlike the previous ones, this one was charged with a dense energy, almost palpable. "You're tampering with something you shouldn't. There's no turning back." The book was beginning to change shape. Its pages, once yellowed, now seemed to vibrate with an energy he couldn't control. And the messages, once simple, began to become more detailed, more profound. He discovered what the dead wanted. They weren't just seeking a voice or recognition. They were trying to warn of a great evil, something that was being unleashed by bringing their voices back. But the most terrifying moment came when the Codex began to write on its own. Entire pages were filled with a story he didn't recognize, but somehow it seemed to have been written for him. "What you're doing now comes with a price, and everyone you love will pay for it." With each word, the hermit felt an increasing pressure on his mind, as if the dead themselves were trying to take over his consciousness. And when he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he saw that his own gaze had changed. It was no longer him looking into the glass. It was them, the dead, taking control. The hermit soon discovered that by opening the Codex Sanguinis, he was not just summoning lost souls, he was destabilizing the very fabric of reality. At first, the changes were small. The sound of the wind grew unnaturally intense. Shadows seemed to move when no one touched them. But soon, these changes became more palpable. Night after night, the hermit would wake up sweating, with the feeling that something was watching him closely. But when he turned to look, the room was empty. There was nothing but a deep, oppressive silence. But the most terrifying part began to happen in the following mornings. Upon waking, he realized that time was no longer following its natural course. Some days dragged on, while others passed in the blink of an eye. Even more disturbing, the people around the village began to change. The villagers started forgetting simple things. If someone met the hermit, their name was forgotten. They would look at him as if seeing someone from another time. But the worst of all came when he began to notice that some souls he had invoked were not just speaking. They were materializing. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room, an ethereal figure that vanished with the slightest movement. But soon, the apparitions became more solid, more real. One night, a woman appeared before him. Her skin was gray, as if made of aged stone. Her empty eyes stared at him with profound sadness. She didn't say a word, but the hermit understood. She was there to claim something. When he tried to move away, an overwhelming pressure took over his body. It was as if his legs were chained by invisible bonds, his hands moving against his will. "You brought us back, so you must keep us here." The words echoed in his mind, and the air grew dense and cold. He was starting to lose control. The Codex had opened a door that couldn't be closed, and soon it wasn't just him who saw these apparitions. Other villagers began to witness impossible events, figures appearing at doorways, screams in the dead of night, and a cold that never left. The hermit no longer knew what was real. He desperately tried to stop reading the book, but the voices kept calling. And every time he tried to pull away, a new soul took form. The question that began to haunt him was simple, but deadly. How long until he became the next to disappear into the void? The hermit no longer knew where reality ended, and the nightmare began. Each night seemed like more of a mental torture, with voices whispering in his ears, forcing him to keep turning the pages of the Codex. And it was on one of these nights that he heard a peculiar sound. It wasn't the wind, nor the trees swaying. It was something deeper, more primal. Suddenly the door of his cabin trembled. Something heavy, something very large was banging against it. The hermit stood up abruptly, feeling the pressure in his chest, as if something was watching him closely. He knew, somewhere in his mind, that it wasn't a man who was there. When he opened the door, the air around him froze, and a monstrous shadow appeared before him. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely non-human. It was an immense figure, cloaked in a substance as black as ebony, with red eyes that glowed in the darkness. The creature didn't speak, but in its presence, the hermit felt his mind being invaded, as if every thought was being searched and distorted. "Who are you?" And he managed to ask, but his voice sounded weak, as if the sound was coming from somewhere far away outside of his body. The creature stepped forward, and with a gesture of its hand, the hermit felt his very essence twist, as if his soul was being pulled out of his body. "I am the guardian of the threshold." The voice didn't come from its lips, but reverberated in his mind with an intensity that almost made him fall to his knees. The being before him didn't seem to want to kill or harm. No, its purpose was different. It wanted something deeper, something more ancient. "You have freed the dead. Now you must pay the price." The hermit tried to step back, but his feet were glued to the ground, as if the very space was trying to swallow him. The being then approached and extended a hand toward him. It wasn't a human hand, but a black, slippery mass, as if it were made of liquid shadows. The sensation was unbearable, as if all of the hermit's life was being drained by the creature, sucked into a place beyond reality. And then he heard the last thing he expected. A deep laugh, echoing as if thousands of voices were laughing at once, coming from the Codex itself. Did you think controlling the dead would come without consequences? In that moment, he understood. The Codex wasn't just a book of necromancy. It was the key to something much greater, much older, something humanity had forgotten. For a very good reason, but now the hermit could no longer turn back. He had opened a door, and what came from it could never be contained again. The hermit, now completely torn apart by the presence of the Guardian and the growing threat of the Codex, knew he no longer had time. Each day that passed, reality seemed to tear further from what he knew. He locked himself in his cabin, surrounded by candles and amulets he hoped would be powerful enough to block the influence of the book. But deep in his soul, he knew that nothing could stop what was happening. He picked up the Codex Sanguinis, which already seemed to pulse with its own energy, and in an act of desperation, he began writing on its pages with his own hand. "How? And can I stop this?" he wrote. "What must I do to return the dead to their rest?" But as soon as the last word was written, a wave of pain shot through his body. He felt as though he was being torn apart from within. His vision began to blur, and the walls of the cabin seemed to disintegrate before his eyes. The Codex, in response, lit up with a grotesque light, as if celebrating his attempt to resist. The words began moving faster, as if the book were feeding on his agony. It was then that the voice of the Guardian sounded once more, not as a word, but as a direct command. "You think you can escape the laws of the beyond? The dead cannot be undone. You cannot turn back. The creature appeared once again, this time in its entirety. The hermit, paralyzed with fear, tried to move away, but his body did not respond. He was at the mercy of that entity that had arisen from the void. You released what was trapped. Now, you must bear the consequences. The voice seemed to have a resonance that penetrated his mind, breaking any resistance he still tried to hold on to. However, the hermit, in a final gasp of resistance, grabbed the codex with all the strength. He had left and did what seemed to be the only option. He burned it. The pages of the book began to ignite, but something even more terrifying happened. When the fire touched the paper, an explosion of light and energy filled the cabin. The air was filled with immense energy, causing the walls to tremble and the floor to open beneath his feet. But what happened next was unimaginable. The book did not burn. Instead, it multiplied. The pages fragmented, spreading like a cloud of dark, viscous dust, falling over everything around him. In an instant, the figures of the dead began to materialize around him, stronger, more tangible, with hollow stares and expressions of fury. They were no longer at peace. They were vengeful. The hermit screamed desperate as one of these figures grabbed him by the throat. He knew there was no going back now. The Codex Sanguinis had already fulfilled its role, to open the doors of the beyond and bring the forces of the unknown into this world. There was no hope left. He had lost the battle against the dead, and now the dead were ready to take everything. The hermit, now completely submissive to the power of the Codex Sanguinis, felt his last resistance being consumed by the shadows around him. The figures of the dead were no longer mere apparitions. They were real, tangible, and now they surrounded him. He could see the faces of the lost souls, their expressions of fury and despair, reflecting the same pain he had caused by opening the forbidden book. He tried to fight, tried to scream, but his voice seemed swallowed by an infinite darkness. Every scream seemed muffled by the very shadows that took shape around him. The hands of one of the dead, the hand of Valentin Ionescu, his childhood friend, reached out toward him with cold, stiff fingers like claws. You released us all. Now we will take you with us. The voice of his friend sounded in his mind, not like a memory, but like a tangible threat. With one final effort, the hermit looked at the codex, now fully aflame, its black pages still glowing with a supernatural light, as if reveling in the destruction. He felt his body begin to dissolve, as if the very essence of his soul was being drawn out of his body, flowing into the abyss that awaited him. And in a moment of absolute terror, he understood. He would no longer be part of this world. His existence now was forever entwined with the dead. The figures began to drag him to the threshold between life and death. And as he felt the pain intensify, he realized that the Codex Sanguinis had not been destroyed. It had become part of the very fabric of the beyond, a force that would never be erased. When everything calmed down, when the light finally went out and the darkness took its place, there were no longer any traces of the hermit. His name had been erased from the memory of the living. His body, now lifeless, had disappeared, taken to a place where time did not exist, where the dead remained trapped in an eternal search for answers, for justice, or for revenge. But one last thing remained. The Codex Sanguinis was still there, somewhere, waiting, and just like the hermit, new readers would be drawn to its promise of forbidden answers. They too, like him, would be lost, because after all, the dead never stop speaking, and the Codex never stops calling. And so, the hermit disappeared, his name erased, his memory dissipated in the vortex created by the Codex Sanguinis. But the story, as always, does not end here. The Codex did not disintegrate. It was not destroyed. It does not need a body, nor a mind. The book is eternal, and as long as there are those insatiable for truth, those who seek the impossible, the Codex will continue to exist, waiting to be found once again. Every year, every century, the book changes hands. It adapts, it hides, but its essence remains unchanged. It is the key to the dead, and the dead, once they call, never remain silent for long. Even now, as you listen to these words, the Codex Sanguinis may be closer than you think. It is waiting for someone with the curiosity or madness necessary to open its pages once more. And so, the story continues, because the Codex never dies, and the dead continue to speak. If you were as fascinated and disturbed by this story as I was, subscribe to the channel now for more dark mysteries and forbidden tales. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the content, and of course, comment below with your thoughts. On this macabre journey, do you believe the Codex still exists, or perhaps would you be the next to seek it? Until the next video, where we will explore more secrets that should remain buried.